Hello, my friends. We are continuing our series with luminaries on the cutting edge of science and spirituality. And it is my great pleasure today to have this conversation with a friend of mine who is also accomplished investigator, explorer of consciousness, and as it relates to neuroscience and peak experiences. Lindsay Briner is a neuroscientist, and we're going to have a conversation on peak experiences and sustained flow. Welcome to this conversation, Lindsay.
Hi, Deepak. Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start a little bit with your background. I think everybody is interested in this topic, peak experiences, steady state flow. But let's go a little bit into your background, your education and your training, and then we'll get to what you're doing right now.
Yeah, sure. I guess it started way back, but I'll start with my master's degree I got in counseling psychology and transpersonal psychology in Palo Alto. And that led me to studying meditation in the brain and the effects of combining different types of meditation with different types of positive psychology methods and how that can transition people into what we called at the lab where I did my PhD internship, persistent non-symbolic experience. And that really inspired. I've been seeing clients for about over 10 years now. And so during my, master's program and my PhD internship at the Transformative Technology Lab, I was seeing clients while doing this research on the brain and on meditation. And I started to naturally attract a lot of executive clients. And so the combination of researching how different types of meditation upregulate different areas of the brain while working with a lot of executives, I kind of just discovered over time emergently this how different methodologies can really support high performers, high achievers, leaders, anyone really, but that kind of gestalt of a person who is trying to prove themselves and work harder to achieve more. And it's just proven to have great success. It's been really fun.
So for those of us who are listening to this conversation, let's give them an idea what you mean by this term, non-symbolic experiences.
So in the lab where I worked for many years, that was Jeffrey Martin's term. And my understanding of it is when a person enters a persistent state and a persistent experience of like non-dual awareness, which I later discovered after I graduated from that lab and continued on my own meditation path and got into the study and practice of Mahamudra and Dzogchen and Bon traditions of meditation, that non-duality is actually just one stage in many, an initial stage, actually the second stage of realization in many stages that continue on, and that it's like a learned pathway in the brain. And over time, you can stabilize that pathway. You can hardwire it by down regulating the hardwiring of like your prefrontal cortex, which is the narrative mind, the monkey mind. And so by learning each stage, you can hardwire or just cross over and transition into maintaining that pathway in the brain.
So when we say symbolic, you just said symbolic experience is a experience of duality. Anything that we experience as a sensation, image, feeling, thought, then gets symbolized as out there. But it is actually an excitation of consciousness, which is non-symbolic, and in Vedic traditions frequently referred to as pure consciousness. And when pure consciousness seeks experience, it generates fluctuations that are called sensations, sense perceptions, images, feelings, thoughts. And if you identify with them, it takes you out of your center, so to speak. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, I would say so. Like the symbolic experience of reality, or what the Buddhists would call the relative nature of reality, is also what I would call, like the narrative mind. It's a collection of stories, the sense of self, or um, the sense of self as an identity construct, a collection of stories and concepts.
Which would also be called the ego mind, right? The
Yeah.
ego mind. Okay. Now you said that there are many stages, so let talk a little bit about Mahamudra and the ongoing development of non-symbolic experiences or states. We shouldn't probably call them experiences, persistent, non-symbolic states. Uh, Say a little bit about Mahamudra and the Buddhist techniques that you've been exploring and how they correlate to what happens in the brain.
Sure. Well, I'll say just generally before I go through the stages that the whole point, right, is to shift the locus of identity from the sense of self as as identity, a collection of identity constructs, to the sense of self as the field of pure awareness. So it's
Mhm.
a shift of the locus of identity, or what Maslow called, self-transcendence, to shift the sense of self to exist in connection to the whole, and not just the ego collection of stories. So that's the goal.
Mhm.
And so in Mahamudra, as I learned from my late teacher, Dr. Daniel Brown, and my current teacher, Destin DePerna, from the Pointing Out the Great Way tradition, the stages of realization start with concentration training. And I found it fascinating to learn that the concentration training upregulates the same area of the brain as flow, as when someone's in a flow state. And so I found that especially useful when working with executive clients. And so they call it one pointedness. And there's different traditions. There's all kinds of different ways to train concentration and focus, but in this tradition there's 9 stages on the elephant path, and it's like very nuanced, bringing online different skills, metacognition, to catch distraction as it's coming online and return to the object of concentration. The second stage is freedom from elaboration, which is when you train the mind to enter into emptiness. And that's when we experience non-duality and non-locality of consciousness. And so I think this is what, Jeffrey's term non-symbolic experience exists in this stage, which is called freedom from elaboration. And this is where it gets really interesting. This is it's really fun to teach this part. It's the sutra, the Heart Sutra in Buddhism, gone beyond the personal identity, emptiness of self, and then emptiness of phenomena such as time and objects in space and time. But really, that's just the beginning. And I think a lot of spiritual teachers and meditation teachers kind of stop there, because it is quite profound when you can experience freedom from elaboration of the narrative mind. The inner critic kind of fades into the background, and it's great. It's freedom from elaboration. But that's really just the beginning. It's the gateway on this path. And the second stage is one taste. When you get into emptiness, it's not, there's still liveliness, right? There's still the liveliness of self. The idea isn't to get rid of the self, which I think is a being misconstrued. The self still exists. It's a central organizing principle of our life. So the liveliness of self, the liveliness of the body, sensations and emotions, and thoughts, it's an uninterrupted flow of liveliness. But when you can train the brain to hold the liveliness as also empty, which is why you first stabilize emptiness, and then the liveliness of emptiness, that the field of awareness is also lively. That's the second stage. And that brings you into one taste, the third stage, where you hold both the liveliness and the emptiness as equal and the same, as a perfect mirror reflection. And that's a great skill to to achieve. And in Mahamudra, they call it the first, the emptiness. When you enter into emptiness, it's the Dharmanakaya. And then when you enter into the liveliness aspect and can stabilize the uninterrupted flow of liveliness with the freedom from the elaboration of liveliness, then you're in Sambhogakaya. And if you can hold, the goal is to hold those two as equal. And then you enter into the view of Nirmanakaya, which is the great compassion. You know, your heart breaks open for the compassion of the self by experiencing the liveliness of the self all the way through, feeling the feelings all the way through as lively and empty. And then your heart breaks open in compassion for everyone in your life. And that's Nirmanakaya. And then you get into non-meditation, non-doing. And this is kind of where I've identified stabilized flow. When you can be in this practice and hold these views, these three views, all the time in all situations. The sitting practice is just to achieve getting there all the time.
So, I'm familiar with these terms, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya, and what you call concentration is referred in yoga to, it's frequently called dharana, focused awareness, which is combined with dhyana, meditation, and ultimately samadhi, which is transcendence. Very similar. The terms are different. Just stay with me for a moment. Dharmakaya, would you agree, is the highest level, right?
Nirmanakaya.
Sorry?
Which one did you say?
Dharmakaya.
Dharmakaya.
Yeah, is what I think in Christian traditions would be called the theososphere. And then Nirmanakaya would probably be called the noosphere. And Sambhogakaya would be called the more expressed level. Is that the way it works? Theosphere, noosphere, biosphere?
It sounds like it.
Yeah. But then when you get to this sustained state, what is the experience? In the first, there's non-duality, then there's liveliness, non-duality, then there's holding the two together, and then there's a sustained flow state, right?
Yeah.
And what are the neural correlates of all this?
Well, you're down regulating the prefrontal cortex, which is the narrative mind. The characteristics are that it's a significant decrease in negative states, an increase in a bringing online of a flourishing of more and more positive traits. And so that happens when we get out of temporal processing in the brain is in the prefrontal cortex, and the learned pathway that I referenced is shifting out of temporal processing into parallel processing. So flow is, termed by Csikszentmihalyi as a unity in action. And that's a parallel processing of the brain in the anterior cingulate cortex. And if you can get there, if you can activate that part of the brain, by practicing meditation, then you also get into gamma frequencies, and that really upregulates the anterior cingulate cortex even more, and the effects are more sustaining over time.
So now, take us through, don't have to go into details, but take us through a typical executive, high achiever, very focused on goals, outcome, and as a result, stressed, perception of threat, etc., physical threat, psychological threat, emotional threat. Such an executive comes to you. What's your process?
Well, it really depends on the person, but I do have a formula, and for stabilized flow, and I've created it in a way where it's really accessible and easy to learn for really busy people who are running companies, what have you. And so it starts by identifying what I call the false self narrative. We all have limiting belief structures from when we had unmet needs as children. like when we, the main question that the ego asks is, am I enough? And we want to, it stems from some time in childhood when we didn't feel safe. And the brain, when we don't feel safe, automatically wants to explain why we don't feel safe. So we create these limiting beliefs to conceptualize our experience, and then they lock in, and fear of failure, having to prove ourselves, and then there's the cultural beliefs of work harder to achieve more and more and more, and so everyone's story is different, and I have methods to easily identify what the core false self narrative is to get that gestalt. And I don't like to over pathologize. I decided not to be a therapist and psychologist, because for that reason. What I found is that you only need to get to know the roadmap of that false self narrative just enough to be able to disidentify from that story. As my meditation teacher would say, you become, those stories become waves in the ocean, and you are not those waves, you are the whole ocean. So that's usually where we start, is that just identifying, where we self-sabotage in our subconscious, and then we add in different daily practices for applied neuroplasticity. So the limiting belief is like pulling it from the roots, right? The depth structures of the subconscious. And then we add positive psychology techniques to build new neural pathways, sprinkle in seeds to grow new flowers of the mind, apply neuroplasticity. And then you add in meditation, and I usually, if someone has enough time to be disciplined with meditation, it takes there's different stages within each stage of realization, and it takes about 2 weeks to master each skill, or as long as that person, if the person only has, twice a week to meditate, then it may take longer, right? But I really work on honing in one skill at a time to make sure that they really master each skill before moving on to the next. And in my group trainings, I just give them all of the information that they need to self-facilitate and to be able to identify and be honest with themselves for what stage that they're at. And so it's a combination of the applied neuroplasticity, the limiting belief work, and the meditation that I found to just work really well for these high achiever types.
So, they say in these non-dual traditions, and you're making that point, you just made the point that the ocean is independent of its waves. Awareness is independent of the experiences it generates. By definition, awareness is free unless you identify with the narrative. If you don't identify with the narrative, you're back to baseline, home base, so to speak, right? And that gives you a sense of freedom. You're not bound by the experiences that are being generated as a result of situations, circumstances, relationships, and the accumulation of stories that karmically bind you. In Buddhist traditions, they call the physical body the conceptual body, or the karmic body, because it's a projection of your stories. And so as you free yourself from your stories, the body goes from a constricted to an expanded, free, and ultimately a blissful state of being.
Yeah, I know. I've been sharing a lot of concepts and frameworks, right? But the whole point is to get out of the conceptual mind.
Correct. So, no, that's very interesting. Now, tell me some of your experiences with your clients.
Well, I wanted to add to that, when we get stuck in these identity constructs of being the wave, it's because we're often, especially with these types of people, these high performer types, is that they're motivated by fear. They're motivated by the addiction to stress and adrenaline, the addiction to being a perfectionist, to, proving themselves, to achieving more, to feel worthy of love, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's our productivity and our drive, the axiom of motivation that's running in our nervous system is often based in fear. And so it's about unhooking and untethering ourselves from those automated algorithms that are running our motivation out of fear and into altruism, into a sense of selfless service. Because when we have that shift of the locus of identity from the ego into the whole nature of reality, and our heart breaks open in compassion, we start to become motivated to be of service. And so that's how I found that to be really useful in working with these high performers, is reminding them of their altruistic goals too, and bringing those into their daily practice, and starting to lock in an identity construct of being motivated to benefit all their people that work for them, how they develop and produce and market their products or whatever it is. Because when you have this shift, your values change and your ethics change. So that altruism becomes exponentially greater and greater. And in Mahamudra and other Buddhist traditions, they call that bodhicitta, developing bodhicitta, to set the intention, before every meditation, for all beings to be free from their suffering.
Some of these executives, do they say maybe it interferes with their success or enhances their success? How do they frame it?
Yeah, I would say that it definitely enhances their capabilities and leadership in a profound way. When the inner critic, the voice of their inner critic, and their tendencies to procrastinate or self-sabotage that are subconscious, those start to fade into the background. So they can be more and more effective in their communication skills, their interpersonal relationships, and their foresight on the long-term goals of their business. When we're locked in our nervous system in fight or flight, in fear, in adrenaline and cortisol, we regress into tunnel vision and make quick short-term decision making. We could snap at people, and it limits us in our form of leadership. And so when they start doing these practices, a lot of our sessions, they show up and they're just like in awe, of how the unexpected changes that start to occur in their relationships and in the business outcomes, because their increased capability to focus and make good decisions. And one example I could share is I work with some growth stage startups here in Silicon Valley, and he had 6 months to raise his Series B. And over the course of those 6 months, his financial runway started to significantly dwindle down to 1.5 months left, and had there was the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank, which disrupted a lot of leads that he had for investors. And he was down to 1.5 months. And during those 6 months, all the way up to having a month left of runway, which is the livelihood of him and all of his employees and their families, et cetera. And for an altruistic company of cancer prevention, this is a good guy doing good work in the world with, good intentions. And every session he would show up every week and just say, like, how am I not freaking out right now? Like, is this real? He was totally centered, totally trusting, and just, in acceptance. And something came through out of left field at the last minute with a month left of runway, which was a miracle. But what was more interesting to me was how he just trusted. And that's my teacher, Dan Brown, would always say that the foundation of the practice is self-trust. And the foundation of self-trust is self-love, self-compassion. So I do a lot of this liveliness of self practice with my clients to get them into their body sensations, to catch the stress response, catch the reactivity as it arises, catch the false stories that from the pit in your stomach generates these thoughts of inadequacy and being not worthy or a failure or whatever. But if you can catch the stress response in the body before it elaborates in the mind, and non-judgmentally and compassionately just allow it to exist and breathe through it, you can eliminate reactivity in the mind as well, and then behavior, etc. And then leadership just exponentializes.
Would you say bringing non-conceptual awareness to the distress in the body is a key, right?
It's an absolute key. It's been blowing my mind recently. I work with a lot of clients that have extreme burnout and that are at extreme risk for burnout, right? Especially these growth stage startups, they move really quickly especially when their Series B comes in, it's this huge growth, new employees, like selling their products. It's this big growth stage. And so they're at risk for burnout. And then I have other clients that are much further along that have been running their companies for, a decade and beyond, and they're in total burnout. And I found that this practice of getting into the non-conceptual mind, mastering emptiness, non-duality and non-locality of consciousness, and then coming back to the liveliness of self from that view, being in the Sambhogakaya, the liveliness or, the magical display of the nature of reality in the body and the sensations of the body and the emotional field too is just so effective for eliminating and preventing burnout.
You'd say probably that then empathy and compassion and service and joy and equanimity emerge spontaneously rather than as forced behaviors.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are ways to reverse engineer those characteristics, which is I do a little bit of that with the applied neuroplasticity techniques, but really it it happens spontaneously if you're doing the limiting belief work with the meditation. And then it's so fun because then it's just like you get to point out what's already occurring. And then the only job of the person is to point it out in themselves, to acknowledge it and recognize it in themselves and gain the confidence, the self-trust, the self-compassion. And then it starts to flourish naturally.
You said that all this distress that these Silicon Valley high ambitious types have is a result of trauma at some time in their childhood or lack of attention or affection or appreciation or acceptance. Is that what ultimately results in this
I think there's a trauma can be a heavy word, but I think we all have a little bit of unmet needs from our childhood because ultimately there's no such thing as a perfect mother, right? We never have, no one, I mean, I would be surprised, but my assumption is that no one has had all of their got all of their needs fulfilled as a child, and so there's a spectrum of severity of trauma, and but not getting enough love or attention for a small child is experienced as not feeling safe, and so the response are these coping mechanisms, right? Dr. Shafali, she calls them ego archetype masks, the perfectionist, the overachiever, the there's a whole list of them, different types of people.
And this has something to do with what you call attachment theory, right?
Yeah, this can all be traced back to different attachment styles for sure.
Uh, can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are different attachment styles. There's the avoidant, the anxious, and then the disorganized, which is anxious avoidant. So the anxious is a person often this framework is used like in intimate relationships, but I also like to apply it to our intimate relationships with our purpose and our work and our career in the world. And so the anxious attachment type is a very clingy in intimate relationships. The avoidant is obviously avoidant, and the disorganized is this back and forth of I love you, come close. Oh, wait, no, I have a boundary. It's the back and forth. And so the secure attachment style is very rare for someone to have naturally, but because, that very rarely people get everything they need as a child, but you can have an earned secure attachment style. And usually that comes from reparenting the self, giving ourselves, identifying what were the needs that we didn't get as a child and providing that for ourselves. And often we project our unmet needs onto our close relationships, our intimate relationships, and even our work is like needing to get seen. It's all like we always collapse into this, especially in this world with social media, et cetera, and the overstimulation of the internet. We collapse into needing external validation to prove that we're worthy of success, right? And so it's about eliminating those patterns and behavioral patterns and thought formations of needing external validation to feel good about ourselves and to feel fulfilled. There's an exercise that I do called Unprovoked Happiness, right? And the idea is that like you don't need to have the huge car and the huge success and the family or whatever it is to be happy. You don't have to achieve happiness. It's our birthright to just have experience unprovoked happiness. You don't need a reason for it, right? And that would be the secure attachment style, where you're just self-contented, simple self-contentedness, egoless confidence of clarity of mind, and that's the secure attachment style.
It's very interesting because it all relates to also the control dramas that we engage in, especially in people in powerful positions, politicians and political leaders. They are nice and manipulative, sometimes nasty and manipulative, sometimes stubborn and manipulative, sometimes playing the victim and manipulative. That's basically a consequence of those dysfunctional attachment styles, correct?
Yeah, when we get stuck in the drama triangle of the hero, the victim, or the villain, right? But then that's called being below the line, in traditional executive coaching. But being above the line would be to be in the virtuous triangle, where the hero becomes the coach, the victim becomes the creator, and the villain becomes the challenger. So it's a way to locate the self, which has to do with liveliness of self. Can you locate where you are? Are you above the line or below the line? Are you enrolling yourself or other people around you in the drama triangle? Because if you're doing that, it's often a projection of those unmet needs, a delusion or obscuration of the false self narrative. So all these practices to transition and to stabilize flow are to see the true nature of your own mind and to get out of these virtual reality stimulations of delusions and the drama triangle and, attachment deficiencies, and really come to see the true nature of reality and the self and in our relationships. And when we can come to see the true nature of our own mind through the liveliness of the self, it's easier to see when other people are projecting their wounds and their drama, right? And so you have more compassion.
This term unprovoked happiness is the same as spontaneous joy, isn't it? The fundamental state of joy that you see in a child.
Yeah, yeah.
Curiosity, wonder, liveliness, affection, attention, all spontaneously before the mind is conditioned into all these control dramas.
Yeah, yeah. There's spontaneous presence too. It's like what occurs when you're not in your survival pattern. It's just presence. And what happens when you're presence? The true nature of mind comes online, the true self comes online, you find your higher purpose through just being truly present out of your survival patterning.
Do you see absence of regret or anticipation and more spontaneity in the moment, less planning, less concern about outcome, more engaged in the process and the joy of the process.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. You nailed it. It's like an effortlessness starts to happen. You know?
Effortless spontaneity. And in Vedanta, they call this effortless spontaneity that leads to the unleashing of the divine feminine as Kriya Shakti. Kriya Shakti means the Shakti or the energy that is independent of karmic baggage. Then Icha Shakti, the spontaneous fulfillment of desire. And then Ananda Shakti, which is the Shakti or the power that comes from just pure joy, or what you call unprovoked happiness.
Yeah, that
Very
was my first and still my favorite book that you wrote, The Spontaneous Fulfillment of Desire.
good. So, listen, Lindsay, this is very powerful, and this is very for the average person who's listening to this conversation. It's who's never heard this conversation. It's pretty dense, but it works, and this is ultimately. I wouldn't say counseling, but it is spiritual therapy, isn't it?
It could be, yeah, but it's also it's a formula of a combination of methods to learn a pathway in the brain. So I've often described it as a brain retraining program. My group coaching program, it's a brain retraining program. You're just engineering different brain states to stabilize flow. And it may sound dense, but it's actually very easy to learn if you're motivated to enhance your experience of flow.
What do you call your process for the general public?
Say it's my stabilized flow method. I have a group coaching program called Leading with Flow, where you learn the formula for stabilized flow.
Stabilized flow. And I'm sure after this conversation on social media, many people will be very curious to find you and to consult you. How can they find you?
LindsayBriner.com, Lindsay with an A.
Lindsay Briner, BRINANER, lindsaybriner.com. That's it. Do you have a website?
That's the website.
Okay. I think this has been a very enlightening conversation, even for me, although I'm a student of this for a long time. I think a lot of people can benefit by going to lindsaybriner.com. And I urge all our listeners to check you out, especially if they're high achievers and stressed about their businesses. The paradox is that when you don't worry about the business, then there is spontaneous fulfillment of worthy goals. That is ultimately what success is, the spontaneous fulfillment of worthy goals, and along with the ability to love and have compassion, but always being connected to your true self. This is basically, I would say, a summary of your amazing work. Thank you so much for joining me. I wish you all success, and I'm sure there are millions of people who could benefit from this brilliant work that you're doing. Lindsay, thank you very much for joining this conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always such a pleasure to see you.